Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Hey, Kate.
Hey, Fahrusha, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well.
I see you have lined up a wonderful guest for us today.
Yes, we actually have one big guest and one listener experience at the end of the show. So we're going to start out our show and let's slate.
Oh, okay.
Today is February 25th, 2017, and our guest today is the wonderful Dr. Penny Sartori, coming to us right from Swansea in Wales.
That's pretty amazing.
It is amazing. One wouldn't have thought that when we were little kids that we would be just talking lickety-split to all over the world. But Dr. Penny Sartori is a very, very interesting guest, and she has written a book called The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences. She has also written another book, but the other book is, I believe, for her college courses, and it's called The Near-Death Experience of Hospitalized Intensive Care Patients, a 5-year critical study. She has been a nurse, and she is a nurse, but right now she is teaching, that she has her doctorate. She is teaching at the Swansea University about death and dying and spiritual transformation. She has 2 special courses there. So let's welcome Dr. Penny Sartori.
Yes, thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, hi. Thanks for asking me. It's lovely to be with you.
I want to make sure that you feel 1,000% welcome, because I'm just going to say a very, very short little story of my own. I've been to Wales twice, which is a lot for an American. The average American may have never gone to Wales, but I've been there twice because I have some of my background from Wales. And one time I went to Wales, it was when they had the Eisteddfod. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly because I'm not a Celtic speaker, but they had the Eisteddfod, and I went out of interest and curiosity, wanting to learn a little bit about that part of my roots, and I was welcomed so nicely, and they signed me up, and they wanted me to come back and tell my story, but unfortunately, I had to catch a plane back to the U.S. of A., but I did spend a day and a half there, and I got a lovely, lovely welcome. Both times I was in Wales, once with my parents, my father being the Welsh part of the group. I mean, he's part Welsh, and I was there with them, and then later I was there once again, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful place. So welcome, many welcomes to you, Dr. Penny. Do you want to start out?
No, not really. I was just fascinated by the whole idea of the near-death experience, but largely from your viewpoint, because you were actually there when it happened. Some people speculate about it, they talk about it, but you've actually seen the passing of people from one state to another state and then back to this state. And so it's really your first-hand experiencer. And
yes, that's right. I was in quite a privileged position, really, and I think my interest in the subject of near-death experience kind of was generated from my work as a nurse. And I think I was just in that perfect place because not only was I fascinated by these experiences, I was actually looking after patients who were having these kind of experiences. So it was a unique and privileged position.
Also, I feel people in the state that they're in, obviously critically ill, sort of develop a very close relationship to the nurses that care for them and trust them and are comfortable sharing their experiences with them, as opposed to, let's say, a stranger that would just walk in. And it's a little bit out of the ordinary to say, I've had a near-death experience, but to be able to experience that and discuss it with someone they trusted also added to it.
Yes, that's right. And I that was one of the findings of my research, really, was how important it is that patients feel comfortable in expressing that they've had these experiences. because a lot of people, out of the 15 cases that I got during my hospital study, it was only 2 patients actually volunteered the information. The others, I found, because I interviewed every single person who had kind of survived a cardiac arrest, and my opening question was, did you recall anything from the time that you were unconscious? Now, most people didn't remember anything, but had I not asked that question, 13 patients would never have spoken about their near-death experience because they were afraid to talk about it. They thought they didn't understand it, and they thought that they may have been going crazy. And the fact that they were able then to express what had happened was a big help to them. So, this is really vital for that all nurses are aware of these experiences.
The patients, the people who had these experiences, it's essential that they be validated. That's essentially what you're saying, I take it.
Yes, absolutely. That is that's the most helpful thing that anyone can do, is to validate that experience for them and say, look, you're not alone. Other people have also reported these experiences. And then there's lots of resources out there that, there's lots on the internet. There's the International Association of Near-Death Studies, which is very helpful as well. So it's important to validate it and to direct them to other sources where they can get help.
I was really interested in your description of the first time that you were working as a nurse, and one of the other nurses said to you that this patient will be dead by a certain time. And you were sort of shocked by that and yet intrigued by it at the same time.
Yes, that's right. I can remember my very first day on the ward as a student nurse. And the night nurse was handing over to the morning staff, and she said, the man in bed 6, section C, he'll be dead by the end of the morning because he's been talking to his dead mother since about 3 o'clock. And I kind of, I thought, oh, wow, were they trying to just wind me up because it's my first day? And I looked around and everyone carried on as if it was normal. And I went out and I observed this patient, and I could see him gesturing to someone who I couldn't see. And I got called away for other nursing duties, but I kept going back throughout the course of the morning to look at this man. And it was about 11:30 in the morning. And I can remember he almost got some energy from someone somewhere, and as if he was trying to sit up, and his arms were outstretched, and he had this lovely smile on his face. And he sort of stayed like that for a few seconds and then relaxed back, and it looked like he'd gone to sleep, but he'd actually died at that point. So, exactly what that night nurse had said, he did die by the end of the morning.
And you've also reported that most people who have died during an experience of that nature, they die reasonably happily. They die with a smile on their face, or they don't seem to be trying to fight it as much when they've been talking to deceased relatives or spiritual entities that they may perceive as being in the room.
Yes, it's as if these visions that they have give them great comfort and prepare them for the journey that they're going to take. And yes, they're very much at peace and at ease, because I've also witnessed patients who aren't at ease, and, they can get quite distressed and agitated. But that certainly isn't the case when people have these visions. And in fact, I was talking to one of the hospice doctors, and she said to me that through her 40-year career, she said, patients who had previously had a near-death experience also had the most peaceful deaths that she'd encountered as well. So these are really conducive to helping patients to have that peaceful and easeful transition into death.
Well, it certainly is certainly it seems to be a major fear of most humans, this fear of dying, and the fact that there may be something other than just nothing is very comforting. And I think work such as yours helps to ease that fear. But what interested me too, you said it's the wisdom of near-death experiences. And what did you refer to by wisdom? I didn't quite follow.
What I found was that patients who came back, who'd had the near-death experience and came back, they were changed in such profound ways. And it was through reflecting on their life. And one of the biggest aspects of the near-death experience to help with this is the life review. And this is where you've heard the expression, my life totally flashed before my eyes. Well, this does happen. And it's more than just flashing past their eyes. It's more of a reliving of their life. And they relive everything. It's the significant things they did, plus all the insignificant things that they totally forgot about. And sometimes it's a total reliving, but sometimes what they can do is swap places with people who they've interacted with. So if they've been unpleasant to someone or inflicted some form of violence on someone, they can feel like what it was like to be in that person's shoes. So they feel the hurt that they inflicted on people, both emotional hurt and physical hurt. And that gives them a very different perspective on that situation. And when they come back to life, they obviously take that on board, and the way they live their life after is very different in most cases.
The three of us here are all tremendous animal lovers. Kate, myself, and our engineer, we're all really wonderful animal lovers. And I know that there have been some cases where people have seen their animals when they're in the near-death experience. And how common is that?
That's quite common. It's more common in children as well. They tend to see their dead pets. And but it is very common. I can remember one lady saying to me that she had a big black Labrador, and she was very close to the Labrador. And when she went into the other realm, she went through that darkness and she found herself in the light. And she was in a beautiful meadow with lovely green grass. And along came her black Labrador dog, bounding across from the other side to greet her. And she said she was communicating with her dog as well in a way that she hadn't communicated before. It was almost like she was reading and understanding the thoughts, and it was full of love for her. So yes, it's quite
Well, that's great, but they better have a lot of tennis balls there if the labs are coming back.
Well, I guess in heaven there are endless tennis balls for endless Labradors. Okay. Do not worry, Kate.
Okay, all right, that's good then. That's good. It's funny, we had a person I knew once, her dog died unexpectedly, and she was very upset about it, and she was asleep. And 2 or 3 days later, just as she was getting up to go about the day, she said, "Oh, sure. Wait a minute. I'll get up. I'll walk you now." And she was getting up and around and petting the dog on the head and getting, half asleep, and then realizing that the dog had died, and then the dog sort of disappeared in front of her. So maybe the spirits do come back. And this lady was very sincere in telling me this.
Wow, yes, that's really interesting. And in fact, I heard something similar the other day as well, where someone who'd lost their cat, and they were very close to the cat. He was about 17 years of age. And during the night, the lady had woken up, and she'd had this really vivid dream where the cat had come back and thanked her for looking after her, and just said it was her time to go. And it was really vivid. And so when she woke up in the morning, she said to her husband what had happened, and his face froze, and he said, "I had that exact dream the night before, but I didn't tell you about it."
Oh my.
So it's like the cat had come back and communicated still.
Yeah.
I personally, have had I've had a couple of dogs, but I've had a lot of cats. And it seems to me that the cats are somehow bonded to their location. And in fact, when I went back to an apartment that I used to live in and actually had a nap there, my cats joined me. The cats that were my companion animals during the stay at that apartment initially, and they had at that juncture had passed. I was laying there, and as I was waking up, I was in that liminal state. I was aware of the cats laying next to me. And it was a very real feeling at the time. And I've also had a dog run down the stairs of the apartment to run out the door. And I was with a friend, a companion, and that friend felt the rush of air next to her leg. She felt it, and I said, "That's my old dog, Junior Pie, running down the stairs to run out onto the street like a bad boy."
Oh, that is so interesting.
Well,
wow.
Well, I think, too, to get back to the wisdom, you were saying, though, that when people do pass on and then come back, they come back with the knowledge that everything actually is one. And this is we're just a little piece of the puzzle here, but eventually everything does go back into being, everything is the same, sort of a noetic experience. And so that would explain the pets, too, because I'm sure, or the animals as well. I mean, they are sentient beings, different than us.
Yes, and there is a lot of wisdom, and some of the things as well that they also say is that they have this experience of oneness, that we're all interconnected, that we're all one, and what we do to others ultimately comes back on ourselves. But it's not restricted just to humans and animals. It's also about the planet as well. And so it's as if they see the wider picture, and they can see the damage that humans are doing to the planet, and they have that realization that we have to work as being part of a planet as well. Mm-hmm. And so very often they kind of change the way that they behave, and they become very eco-friendly and are very mindful of their behaviour as well towards the planet. So it's something really that is essential if our planet is going to survive. It seems like we're at this crisis point, and I think wisdom like this will go a long way to further our evolution.
I agree, and I think that that's basically the Gaia principle, and I also think that the planet will continue physically without us and most of the mammals if we screw up, because that's the direction things may go. I'm not going to say, I'm going to try to be in a positive mood today, but the planet physically will continue to hurtle through space, I'm sure. But there are people who say that we're in the midst of the fifth great extinction on the planet. But that's not what you came on to talk about primarily. So we'll move on to other aspects of the near-death experience, as well as maybe you could give us an overview of the steps that you see, because different researchers report much the same information, but they may put more emphasis on one aspect of the experience than the other. For instance, for myself, as a person who studies what is roughly called the paranormal, the most veridical part of a near-death experience for me is the out-of-body part, where the person who has essentially died or is in the process of dying can see what's going on at a distant location, and then that information that they bring back is then verified by people who were perhaps even unaware of what was going on. Can you speak to that part a little?
Yes, absolutely. And that is one of the things that I tried to verify with my research. And in the hospital where I did the research, I had these cards that I cut out random images from magazine articles, and I put them on very brightly coloured paper to attract attention. And I hid those on top of the cardiac monitor at each patient's bedside, and that was mounted off. It was above head height. Even if you were particularly tall, you couldn't see what was on the top, and there were ridges around to conceal them. So the only way these images could be viewed was if you were out of your body. Now, what I found with my research, in the 5 years of my data collection, there were 8 patients who claimed to have out-of-body type experiences. But what I found is that the quality of the experience varied very greatly. So, for example, there was one man, and he used to have frequent out-of-body experiences. He would go into like a trance-like state for no reason at all, and he would just stare ahead. And the reason that we discovered this was because a new nurse was looking after him at the time, and she got a little bit concerned, and she took off some blood and analysed the blood to see if there was a problem there. And she said to him, what happened then? And he said that he'd been out of his body, he'd been up near the ceiling and looking back on her uniform. So I described the research to him and I said, okay, if it happens again, see if you can float up to the monitor and tell me what is on there. But every time he did have an out-of-body experience, he floated into the middle of the room. And so it was nowhere near where the symbol was located. So he didn't see the symbols. There was another lady and she floated, but it was only probably about a metre above her bed. So she didn't float high enough to see that symbol. And so it was varying different qualities. But there were 2 patients who had the type of quality of experience where they would have been in a position where they could have viewed that symbol. And both of those patients said to me that they were so concerned with what we were doing to their body and looking around at the emergency situation that they weren't looking on top of the cardiac monitors and they didn't know that the symbols were there. So it was a lot of hard work to get that aspect of the study set up, and none of the patients actually did see that symbol. But if you think about it, in 5 years, I only captured 2 patients who had that type of quality sort of experience where they could have viewed it. So I think we need to do far more research and for a much longer period of time before we can get any real results on this.
This brings me to kind of a question and a statement about that. I think that many of these experiences, as you have somewhat indicated in your book, are on a spectrum. I myself have studied remote viewing with a number of very prominent teachers and people who have been with the Stanford Research Institute, like Russell Targ and, Joe McMoneagle and other military remote viewers, Skip Atwater and David, my brain is David, can't think of his last name.
Biedny, but
no, not Biedny, no. But in any case, I think particularly Russell Targ, though Skip Atwater may have mentioned this as well, that during the time that they had people like Uri Geller and like Pat Price remote viewing, that most of them kind of left their body in a different sense and could not read what was on cards, but they could distinguish things like an object. Like, let's say, if you put a card up somewhere that said rubber ducky, they would be very unlikely to be able to read that. They'd be more likely to see a picture of the rubber ducky, and they would be very likely to see the rubber ducky if you were able to conceal it on a shelf high enough that it would not be seen to a person on the ground. So you would be kind of, making that a blind experiment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a really interesting point, actually. Most of what I put up there was actually symbolic images, so random pictures sort of a surfer surfing on a surfboard in the ocean, a chicken in the middle of somewhere, an advert for sort of some kind of cleaner, household cleaner and things like that. So it was random things. But that was a good point because, in fact, there was a lady who contacted me. She wasn't part of my hospital research, but she said that she'd had an out-of-body experience many years before when she was in the intensive care unit. And she's a nurse, so she's familiar with these kind of the scenery in the intensive care unit. But she said she floated up to her monitor and she could see the screen, but she couldn't make sense of it. She couldn't read it. So that's kind of verifying what the remote viewers have said as well.
Yeah, so most of them, there is maybe one out of a 1,000 trained remote viewers who have had good results in their remote viewing. Very, very few of them can read any letters. at all, like reading English or whatever language they might speak. Very, very few of them can read something. Maybe one or two in the entire experience of a gentleman like Russell Targ, who has an enormous amount of experience in the area. But it's your symbols would come in at the midpoint of it being a flat image, whereas perhaps had you had a physical object like a rubber ducky, I hate to use that again, but there may have been more people seeing it. I just throw that out there. So why don't you go over from your point of view the steps that might happen most commonly in the archetypical near-death experience?
I think also that you also discussed, I think your most interesting case to you was patient 10. And,
yes, that's right, yeah.
And that
patient 10 was a really interesting case. In general, the kind of things that the patients reported in the hospital research, the common things were entering into another realm, and where they met up with deceased relatives and friends. And that was the most common thing, was meeting up with the deceased relatives or friends. Now, before I'd started my research, I was very aware that people do meet up with relatives and friends. But what I found was a little bit different in my research is that some of these relatives were angry at seeing their loved ones there, and they were pointing their fingers at the one lady in my research said, when I went to that other place, my mother was there and I was so happy to see her, but she was really angry at me and she was pointing her finger at me and saying, what are you doing here? It's as if I shouldn't have been there. She was saying, you go back down, you go back to the children. And she ended up back with the children. There was another man who said he found himself in this blackness all of a sudden, and it was like a bit like a tunnel, and he said in that tunnel were friends and colleagues that he'd used to work with, and they were all dead, and they were very angry that he was there, and he felt really bad because he felt, I shouldn't really be here, and they were very angry at him and shouting at him. So that was something that I wasn't expecting, where the dead relatives displayed kind of anger or annoyance at them being there.
Wow.
So that was quite interesting. But, the majority of people felt it was a lovely experience and that they wanted to stay there, and they were quite happy to stay there, and they didn't want to come back to life. And I think the most interesting case in my research was the case of patient 10. And it was fascinating because I was there at the time it was happening, only I didn't realise until the patient fully regained consciousness about 4 hours later. So we'd put him to sit in the chair. He was recovering from critical illness and he was doing very well. And when he was sat in the chair, I noticed that his breathing pattern had changed. His oxygen levels dropped a little bit. So he still had a tracheostomy. So I give him some extra oxygen into the tracheostomy. And then he went cold and clammy, and his blood pressure started to drop. And all of these were signs that a cardiac arrest could have happened. So I quickly called my colleagues and we got him back into bed. But by this time, he was deeply unconscious and he wasn't responding to painful stimuli. The doctor had been called and he came to review and gave some fluid for his blood pressure. But then the doctor had to go back to another emergency. And then after a few minutes, his blood pressure began to deteriorate again. So my colleague kept an eye while I went to find another doctor. So this doctor he was literally just walking on duty that morning. And so I said, quick, can you come and review my patient? So he did, and he shone a pupil torch in his eyes to check that his pupils were reacting. We treated it again, his blood pressure, with some more fluid, and after about 20 minutes the doctor was satisfied that his condition had stabilised and he went off to his office. We were calling the patient, trying to rouse him, but he was not responding to anything at all. He was deeply, deeply unconscious. But after that 20 minutes, he started to kind of flicker his eyelids and started to move his limbs. And these were all signs of regaining neurological function. So we were happy that he was doing well. Now, about 4 hours later, he regained full consciousness, and this was as the doctors were doing their ward round. And he was very excited about something, and he was trying to talk, but he couldn't because he had a tracheostomy. So the physiotherapist got a letterboard, and he spelled, "I died and I watched it all from above." And the doctor said, "Oh, you'd better tell Penny about that." And but the thing about the doctor is that he actually acknowledged that, and he documented it in the patient's notes that he revived and reported a near-death experience. And when I interviewed this patient, he described that he'd left his body, he was looking down from above, and he described my actions, he described the actions of the doctor, and correctly identified which doctor had examined him, although he hadn't been around prior to the patient losing consciousness. And he also described the physiotherapist looking very nervous and poking her head around the curtains. Well, all of these things happened, but they happened during the time when he was deeply unconscious and his eyes were closed. The only time his eyes were open was very briefly when the doctor shone that pupil torch in them. So he described everything with great accuracy, and I know he was accurate because I was there at the time. And he also described going upwards into a pink room where he met his dead father and a lady who he didn't know, but he recognised from the photos. It was his dead mother-in-law. And he also saw a man who he said, "I'm not sure who that man was, but it might well have been Jesus. But it's not what I expect Jesus to look like because his hair was long and scruffy and needed to be combed." And he said he also had very piercing eyes, and he was drawn to look at his eyes. But he said he was so happy there. All his pain had disappeared. He was really in a blissful state. But the Jesus-type figure said, "No, it's not your time. You have to go back." And he said he started to fade backwards. And as soon as he faded back, that image just faded in front of him, and he ended up back in his body. And he said he was in immediate pain, and he said the pain was so bad that he wished that he'd died. He said it was really terrible, terrible thing. But the interesting aspect about this case was that when I interviewed him in depth, he misinterpreted one of my questions. And this man has cerebral palsy. He was 60 years of age at the time this happened, and his right hand is always in a permanently contracted position. So it's in like a claw-like shape. But after his experience, he has now been able to open out his hand fully, and there is no physiological explanation for this. I've asked the doctors and the physiotherapists about it, and they said it shouldn't be possible without surgery to release the tendons, because the tendons would be in a permanently contracted position. But no such surgery was carried out. There was no hand physiotherapy carried out. So that is something that really fascinates me, because as a result of his near-death experience, he can now open out his hand. Now, if we understood that in more depth, there are millions of people out there who have similar ailments, and there may be some techniques, therapeutic techniques that we could develop that would, really help a lot of people without them having to have surgery. So I think that's a fascinating aspect.
Well, meditation to the point of kind of being out of your body might help a bit. But that is, when I read that in your book, I was really fascinated by that from a variety of viewpoints. But with me even though I work as an intuitive reader, I am a very practical person. And I realize that to convince people of these phenomena, which are very real, it so much helps to have like this veridical evidence, like this gentleman had. It's very, very important to spread the news about this phenomena, I believe.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I really hope that there are other nurses out there who would follow in my footsteps as well and do their own research, because the more people doing this research, the more likely we are to come across more cases, and they're of great benefit to everyone. So I think it's really important that more people are inspired to do more research.
I had just been writing an article for a private blog. And so I can't tell you the identity of this person, but the interview that I did with this person, he was explaining his spiritual progression, you might say. But when he was in college, he had a knee operation. He was nowhere near death. It was, he was under anesthesia. It was an involved arthroscopic type knee operation. He had to be on the operating table for a significant period of time. And he did float out of his body, and he did identify things outside of his body that he had no business knowing. And that, in fact, was the start of his spiritual journey. So these things have a great effect on individuals. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the differences that you've turned up culturally.
Yes, well, people from different cultures experience the experience in a very different way. So, for example, whereas in the West, it's to do with sometimes the images that they see and the deities that they meet. So in the West, it's more likely to be someone like Jesus or Mary. Whereas in India, for example, they're more likely to see Yama, or the god of the dead, or Yamadoots, which are messengers of the god of the dead, or sometimes there's Chitragupta as well. And Chitragupta is the man with the book, and it's a book of deeds, and the deeds of the person's life. So it's almost as if in India the life review is replaced by looking in this book of deeds of the person, and depending on the kind of deeds that they've done in their life, that decides where the kind of journey that they go on to from that point. So there's those sorts of cultural differences as well. And I think the biggest one is between probably India as well.
That reminded me when I read that in your book about the fellow with the book of deeds, and sort of in Southeast Asia too, if I'm not mistaken. It reminded me so much of the famous poem Abu bin Adam. Are you familiar with that poem?
No, I'm not, no.
Well, I promise you, Dr. Penny Sartori, I will send it to you when our interview is done. I think you would find remarkable concurrence between that poem and the tradition in India. So just let's slate here again, because we're about at the middle of our podcast, Kate. We're interviewing Dr. Penny Sartori, her book, The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences. And you do have a website as well, right, Dr. Penny?
Yes, I do. The website is www.drpennysartori.com.
It's Sartori.
That's right. Yeah. And are you still collecting people's accounts?
Yes, I am. I'm very, very slow with responding to people. I've got a massive backlog of people who have actually emailed me. So I'm currently in search of a research assistant to help me with that, because I just can't manage working full time plus doing my NDE work plus my family life as well. So I need to get a research assistant. So I'm still collecting cases, and I will answer you. It'll just take a little bit of time, that's all.
So are you working on a particular study right now that is involved in these areas? Is there something that we can look forward to seeing from you in the not-too-distant future?
Well, I've just completed a manuscript for another book that I've co-authored with a lady called Kelly Walsh. And this is about the transformative aspects of near-death experiences. So the book is called The Transformative Power of Near-Death Experiences, and that should be released in the UK, I think, in the fall of this year. So around about October, November. And what we've done is we realised that, near-death experiences can really transform people's lives in many different ways. And we've got many great cases where people have been totally changed by their experience, and they have put the way that they've been changed, they've put it into action. So the lady who I've co-authored with is called Kelly Walsh, and she had an experience after she had had a suicide attempt, and she was very depressed at the time and very anxious, and things had built up over many years. And when she was recovering on the psychiatric ward, she had a very profound, spiritually transformative experience, and it completely changed her life. And when she came out of her experience, when she was on the ward, she kept saying to everyone around her, like-minded souls are coming together to change the world. And she kept repeating that over and over. Wow. And since then, and you know, she's been totally transformed. She's networked with people from all over the world, and she's got some really great examples together of people who've had transformative experiences, and that's what this book is going to be about. And Kelly, as a result of her experience, all that depression and anxiety that she'd felt most of her life growing up from being a small child, that was transformed as a result of that experience. And I just think that's so powerful, because we haven't got any drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, that could have such an effect on depression and anxiety. Yet these experiences have transformed that into something very positive for her. And she's also now known as a Positivity Princess, and she's developed a children's character, which is there to support young children and to help them through if ever they feel anxious or depressed. So it's all about empowering other people as well. So it's going to be an interesting book to read about, because there's so many people whose lives have been transformed as a result of their experience. And they all say at the end of the day that it's all down to that interconnectivity, and that we're all love at the end.
No, I was just going to say, but a lot of times, regardless of what aspect of the paranormal you're interested in or investigating, it tends to get, sort of smirked at by the rest of the population. But that is actually the essential idea of studying the paranormal, is to turn it into normal, to understand what's been going on. And I think your studies have proven that. I mean, from what had been a paranormal aspect, it's now becoming very useful and very normal, and it's very worthwhile.
And your achievements in both your studies and becoming a doctor and becoming a nurse and working professionally with respect from those around you does an enormous amount to raise the standards of what people think about it. I have more than one further question, but I have one question. At this juncture, I don't think any interview would be complete without talking about something you touched upon just now, and something that you did cover quite thoroughly in your book. Those two things are, sometimes people have negative or hellish experiences. That's the first thing. And the second thing is the effect of the near-death experience on suicided people.
Yes.
So you did speak a little. Now this wonderful woman, Kelly, who I assume is somewhere in the UK to be working with you. But there have been other people that you had mentioned who had frightening near-death experiences, and there are people who get depressed after it because they can't go back, quote-unquote, home again right away. So aside from the people who can't go back to the near-death experience right away, what about the people who have had hellish experiences, and what about suicides in general?
Yeah, right. Well, with the distressing experiences, now these are very difficult to research, because there's a lot. Some experiences are so bad that it can be very traumatic just recalling the experience itself. But not only that, there's also some sort of stigma involved as well, because people hear about all these lovely experiences, and then if they've had a distressing kind, they think, what's wrong with me? What have I done? I must be a really bad person to have had this distressing kind of experience. Now, it's nothing. There's not much research out there. Nancy Evans-Bush has done a lot, the most in this area, and it doesn't seem to be the moral character of the person. It's nothing to do with that, because even the nicest of people can have really distressing experiences. But we don't know why. There's a possibility that it might be something to do with the ego, and people are holding on and clinging on to life and like resisting the experience. And it seems that when they kind of relax into the experience, it can turn into a more pleasant experience. So there's a few cases where this distressing kind has turned into a pleasant experience. There's a recent case actually of Dr. Rajiv Party, and his book has just come out, and he describes where he started off going into like a hellish realm, and he could smell burning flesh, and he could see big raging thunderstorms in the background. And he suddenly had a realization during his experience, and he thought, I've been living my life in a very unforgiving way. I don't forgive myself, and I don't forgive others. And as soon as he had that realization of the way that he was living his life, that changed into a very pleasant experience from that point on. So a lot of people kind of also feel that sometimes, although it's a distressing experience at the time, sometimes it can act like a wake-up call as well. And people think, wow, I've been living my life in this way. And it kind of jolts them into a new way of living their life after the experience. So, but with the distressing near-death experiences, they are far more difficult to research because people simply don't want to talk about them if they've had the really distressing kind where they feel like they've been in hell. And sometimes when people email me, they'll email me and say, are you still interested in the distressing kind of experiences? And I'll say, yes, if you would like to open up and tell me about your experience. And then maybe in about 3 months' time, I'll get another email from that person, and they'll give a little bit of information, but not much. And then sometimes I won't hear from them for about another 3 or 6 months, and they'll start to give me more information bit by bit. So it's not easy for them to kind of recall and write about.
That's curious in itself, the time delay aspect. And what about suicides? There's a lot of disagreement amongst spiritual communities in the United States about the effects of suicide on the purported soul of the individual, that if they've suicided themselves, they're sort of demoted on a spiritual realm, and they must come back, and they have unfinished business. And then there is another camp that says sometimes people take their lives and they're forgiven, and things go on. Now, I'm going really far into the hypothetical here, but is there anything that you can enlighten us in that regard?
Well, there was some research done a good few years ago now, and people who had previously made multiple suicide attempts, if they had a near-death experience, what they found was that they were less likely to attempt suicide again. If they had the near-death experience, they realised that they take their problems wherever they go, and so there's no escaping them, so they have to face their problems. But it also gave them a different perspective on life as well. So there were a few patients who had previously had multiple suicide attempts, but on the final suicide attempt, they'd had the near-death experience, and they didn't try to commit suicide again after that. So it had a very powerful effect on them. And it's also been used as well. There are a lot of forward-thinking therapists, and what they do is if patients are suicidal and are having real problems in this area, they tend to encourage them to read accounts of near-death experiences and really engage thoroughly with what those accounts are saying. And what they find is that it starts to give people a different perspective on life. And so it can be very powerful as a deterrent to suicide as well. So, there's a lot of potential therapeutic benefits with near-death experiences.
And how do you deal with the so-called scientific community that talks about hypoxia, and the reason it is universal is because it's a universal physiological effect of, let's see, I don't know, the heart stopping, blood sugar decreasing in the brain, lack of oxygen, all the things that are associated with death.
Yeah, well, I tried to look at those with my research as well, and that was some of the things I did. I took bloods off the patients.
You did?
But I found it was very difficult in some cases because although it was documented in the notes that blood had been withdrawn, I unless I was there while it was happening, it was very difficult to discern exactly if the blood had been withdrawn at the time that the person was having their near-death experience. So in many cases, it could only act as a guide. But there were a few cases where blood was extracted at the precise time when the patient was unconscious and having that near-death experience. And the blood results were actually within normal limits. So they were only about 2 or 3 cases. So it's not enough to be statistically significant. But the fact that patients reported having this heightened state of awareness while their blood results were normal was kind of didn't really fit in with the explanations that we are given for near-death experiences, and also with the drugs as well. I looked at the drugs that we gave to the patients, and what I found was quite surprising, because I found if patients were given drugs like morphine or the sedative drugs, they were less likely to report an experience. So that is something that was really important to me, because I feel that it's very important that we don't over-sedate people at the end of life as well, because that in itself may be kind of denying them a valid aspect of the dying process as well. So I think it's really important that we get a balance right. You know, I don't think any patient should be in pain as they're approaching death, but it's important also that they're not over-sedated as well, so that they get to experience all aspects of the dying process.
You had mentioned the drug ketamine, which is, I believe, used as a baby for little children when they're getting operated on. And the ketamine does produce sometimes a similar but not the same experience. Is that the case? It can do. It's there are cases where patients have been given ketamine and reported the out-of-body kind of experience as well. So it might be that the drug kind of facilitates access to an altered state of consciousness rather than kind of producing an altered state of consciousness or producing an experience. So it's almost like our understanding of consciousness is kind of the reverse of what it should be, because materialist science believes that consciousness is created by the brain, and if the brain stops working, so does consciousness. But near-death experiences tend to throw that out the window, really. So I think it's more likely that the brain mediates consciousness as opposed to creates consciousness. And I think the brain might act like a kind of a filter, and it screens out this heightened state of awareness, which is always around us, because we'd be too overwhelmed by it. But there are times in the person's life when that filter action becomes more relaxed. So when people are near death, or perhaps when they've had certain drugs like LSD or ketamine, that filter action relaxes and it facilitates that experience of this heightened state of reality, or true consciousness, if you like. Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. And most of the quantum physicists, the Max Plancks of the world, rest his soul, would agree, because he said consciousness is fundamental, and those are the words that I live by personally. We're almost out of time at this juncture, Dr. Penny, and we're so happy that you had joined us. I have maybe 2 last questions, and do you have something that you have?
No? Go ahead.
The one thing is, along the spectrum of these experiences, we spoke a little bit about that when I spoke of remote viewing and out-of-body experiences that are not connected to a dying process. And then there are people who we interview, a number of these people who are involved with purported UFO encounters with others. I'm not going to call them aliens. I'm not going to call them spiritual beings, but encounters with others while very much alive. And I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, in fact, some of the things that people report went through alien abductions. Now, I don't know a great deal about this. I've not looked into this in great depth. But some of the things that they report, like time disappears, there's no concept of time during the experience. there are certain things that are quite similar to near-death experiences. And I know back in the 1980s, Professor Kenneth Ring, he also noted different similarities between the near-death experience and alien abductions. And he wrote in one of his books about these experiences as well and how similar they could be. So, it is something to keep an open mind about, really.
Well, if you say the conscious is universal, well, then obviously it's universal for everybody and other sentient beings as well. So that's not surprising. No.
And not all beings are necessarily corporeal.
No.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
But we can only go by what we know.
That's correct. Well, Dr. Penny, I want to thank. I hope you don't mind me calling you Dr. Penny. That came up sort of naturally here, but. We want to thank you so very much for being on Shattered Reality Podcast. We want to invite you back to come on when you release your book. Either it doesn't matter if it's only released in the UK or if it's in the UK and the US. Believe it or not, we do have some very fervent listeners over in jolly old across the pond, as they say. So we're looking very much forward to having you back, and perhaps the lady Kelly Evans, was her name?
Walsh.
Kelly
Walsh.
Kelly
Walsh.
And books are also universal now.
What's that?
Books are also universal now. Just because they're published in England doesn't mean they can't be read all over.
That's correct.
It's on the net.
So come on back, and why don't you just go over your particulars so people who may have
just tuned in or started to listen or whatever.
In earnest, those people who have just started to listen in earnest will actually hear all your particulars.
I've got a website, and the website address is www.drpennysartori.com. And feel free to contact me. I'm very slow with my emails at present, but I'm hoping I will be a bit quicker in the future. But I'd love to hear from anyone who's had an experience.
Okay, well, thank you. This has been Dr. Penny Sartori, The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences, a wonderful book which is available through your booksellers.
All over. Thank
you so much, and goodbye, Dr. Penny Sartori.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
So Shattered Reality is proud to introduce one of its listeners, whose name is Despina, who is a Greek-American woman from a reasonably local area around here. And she has had a rather miraculous experience that she would like to share with other Shattered Reality listeners. Despina, are you there? Welcome to Shattered Reality.
Hello, thank you. My parents are from an island called Chios. It's on the Aegean side, and we have a saint. Her name was Markella, Saint Markella, and basically her story is that her mother passed away when she was a young girl, and when the mother passed away, the father became a drunk, and he started abusing his daughter. And the way the story has been told to me by my grandfather is that whenever he would get drunk, he would abuse his daughter. So one day, as opposed to sitting and taking her father's abuse, she started running through the fields, and the father started chasing her with a machete.
Ooh.
And whenever he would find himself lost and not knowing which direction she went to, people working in their plots of land, cultivating the olive trees, I suppose, they would point to which direction she ran to. Eventually, she reaches the water, and she prays to God, may he swallow her from her waist down so that her father does not harm her again. And the story goes that, indeed, the earth opened and swallowed her. And when the father approached her, he cut off her breasts.
Oh.
And I believe eventually he also cut off her head. My grandfather had told me that for generations to come, for those individuals that actually pointed to which direction she was running to, their children were born either with their fingers crooked arthritis, and basically their pointer finger was most always deformed. And it was basically, as my grandfather said, a curse for, pointing to which direction she was running to. So when I was a young child and going through some difficult times, I had prayed to Saint Markella, and I had said that I would walk from my home to her home, which was approximately 30-mile walk in the month of August. So I made a plan with one of my friends that she would wake up 3 hours after I had started my journey at 5 a.m., and she would bring me water as needed. So I began my journey at approximately 5 in the morning, and I started walking. When I finally reached the top of the first mountain, I found myself very conflicted and very angry with myself for taking such a journey by myself, because I was already tired. I took off my shoes, I lit a cigarette, trying to figure out if I'm going to continue on this journey. And as I was having these negative thoughts about actually turning back, in August in Greece, it gets very hot and there is no wind. Rarely will you feel any wind in your hair. All of a sudden, this wind picked up where there was a sign on the side of the mountain, and the wind got so strong that these pebbles started falling from the mountain and hitting the sign. And I recall saying, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. Stop. And I don't know who I was talking to, but I put my shoes back on and I started walking. And when I got back on the road, I felt this wind just pushing me forward. Eventually, the sun came up and I found myself in front of a chapel, and a small chapel on the roadside. And there was this woman there, and a wall. In the middle of this wall, there was a well for water. And she invited me over, and she said, come sit with me. So I don't know why. I actually went and I sat with her. And she pointed up to the mountain, and her husband was up above with his sheep. And it was day of fasting. So she offered me a potato, boiled potato, olives, and some bread. So we had something to eat, and then she went over to the well, I remember, and she put her hand in the bucket when she got the water, and she drank some from her palm of her hand, and she told me, look, it's clean, you can have some water. So I had some water, and then she gave me her cane, which was from a branch, and she said, you have to stop cutting through people's fields. You have to follow the road. And I remember thinking, how in the world does she know that I was cutting through people's property and not walking on the road? So she told me, you're going to use my cane and you're going to push the road behind you. Just keep on pushing, and you're going to reach to another village. You're going to ask for so-and-so and tell her about your journey, and she'll give you some water and something to eat. So I left. I followed her directions. I continued to walk. And then another time came after hours of walking, where I got exhausted, and again I was questioning myself, what I put myself into, and there was no people anywhere around me. So it's either walk back home or continue walking. And again, a gust of wind lifted, and feeling, being pushed. I felt like somebody was pushing me forward. And I remember at a point where I finally saw a car coming, and there was some sheep, and the sheep saw the car, so obviously they thought food was coming, so they were all surrounding me while we were walking, which was very beautiful. So after that, I just continued on walking. I got lost, and when I got lost, I had to walk on a beach, so I was walking through sand for a while, which made my trip a little bit more difficult because I was already tired. And finally, towards the end of the journey, when there was 3 more loops around, because I'm walking down a mountain now, so you have to go around and around, and I had the church in sight, I just got this abundant amount of energy, and I just started running towards the church.
The Church of the Saint. The Church of the Saint.
Yes, Markela. I finally reached there, and I just ran. And I remember my friend who was following me with her car. She was yelling at me to slow down. I'm going to fall down because I must be exhausted already. And I ran into the church. There were people there. I waited for them to exit. And I went into the church, grabbed a handful of candles, and I lit them for my loved ones and family. And I just began to cry. I went for a swim afterwards because there's a beach right there in order to unwind from the long journey. And I told my friend who was bringing me water throughout this, it was approximately 10 hours that it took me to get there.
Wow.
I told her about the woman that fed me, the woman that, gave me her cane that I had with me now. And my friend told me that morning before she woke up that she had a dream. And it just so happened in her dream, the woman and man that she saw in her dream that happened to be her friends have the same name as the woman saw. And that today she has a big day ahead of her and she has to look out for me. So me and her decided that we're going to go back to where I was to find the woman and thank her and return her cane. We drove, I think, for approximately maybe 45 minutes or so, trying to find the chapel, trying to find this wall, the woman, anything. We did not find any evidence of it. We didn't find a chapel. We did not find a wall. We didn't see any sheep anywhere. It's as if all of it was simply a dream.
Wow.
So that's my story. The cane, I gave it to a friend of mine that was diagnosed with cancer later on and told her to just remember my journey and that everything will be okay. But unfortunately, the cane, after my friend's health recovered, the cane was lost. We never found it again. Nobody knows whatever happened to it.
But your friend did recover.
Yes, my friend did recover.
Huh.
Thank God.
Huh. Wow.
But we stored the cane together in her parents' house. I mean, she and I put it away. We wrapped it up in a plastic bag and we safely stored it away.
Huh.
And that I had said when I return, I'll take it back to America. And when I had gone back, me, her parents, and my friend all searched for it. And for over 2 hours, perhaps, in their basement, and we could not find it. So we don't know what happened to the cane.
Well, that is an amazing story.
That's really
Despina.
very interesting.
It's really a beautiful story, and it reminds me just a little bit of the road that people take in Spain. There was a movie about it, about a certain the road of a certain saint that people take from one end of Spain to the other. And the movie is quite interesting. I think you might benefit from viewing that movie because there's quite a bit like that in your story. But Despina, thank you so much for sharing your story with the other listeners to Shattered Reality, and hopefully it will encourage them to share their story as well. Thanks, Despina, and bye now.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Coming up next on Shattered Reality, we have Tom Butler, who is an expert in EVP, electronic voice production. And this has to do with, again, The Departed. And don't worry, we'll get off the subject of The Departed sooner than later. But just following in that vein, we have coming up next a very, very interesting man who has devoted a good portion of his life to researching electronic voice production, where an electronic instrument, such as a radio or a computer or a telephone or a tape recorder, picks up the voice of another entity, purportedly the voices of the dead as well. So we're going to let Tom Butler explain that all to you on our next show.
Until then, this is Kate Valentine
and Fahrusha
saying goodbye from Shattered Reality. Bye.